And we've seen it enjoyed great success hitting Russian oil refineries and gas production facilities. We've seen about 20 from 30 of these really major facilities going up in smoke, huge blazes at those facilities, probably inflicting hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of damage on Russia's economy, and also depriving Russia of vital fuel for its tanks and jets.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are joined by Maxim Tucker. Maxim is the Times' Ukraine correspondent, and he's been reporting from the front lines in Ukraine since 2022. Maxim, great to see you again. And you're joining us from Kharkiv. Just before we started this conversation, you told me about a close shave you had yourself. What's been happening?
Yeah, the Russians obviously stepped up their drone attacks on Kharkiv and other frontline cities. And we had a close call last night. One of the drones came. You could hear the engine, the motorbike kind of sound of the engine coming closer and closer and closer. And then there was this almighty blast, which lit up the whole room orange. And then I looked outside and saw the kind of something had intercepted the Shahed drone, and it was falling into a courtyard, maybe 150 meters away from us. So a bit of a close call here in Kharkiv.
And how often is this kind of thing happening in the city?
It's pretty much every day, every night. There are air raids alerts nearly constantly in Kharkiv. Some of those are missiles that go overhead. Some of them are drones that are targeting other areas. But Kharkiv has been hit pretty hard. It's very, very close to the Russian border, and it's very easy for the Russians to strike at Kharkiv. And of course, it's very important for Ukraine. It's a hub of industry. It's a hub of engineering. And it is Ukraine's second largest city.
Yeah, Maxim, you've reported from Ukraine so many times and been to the front line. Is this in the most danger you have felt yourself to be?
Sadly not. No, we've had a few close calls reporting over the years. If it's a Russian heavy bomb striking even a kilometer away, that can feel sometimes more dangerous than a drone going off overhead. There's artillery nearly constantly when we go into the fields. Some of the places that we go just feel more dangerous because you're more exposed to FPV drones, and the idea of being hunted by an FPV drone is particularly horrifying, just because it's so intimate and personal. Someone's watching you on a camera somewhere. And so when you hear an enemy drone in the air above you, that kind of enemy drone, it's perhaps more frightening.
And that's happened to you as well?
Yes, again, actually in Kharkiv, during the Russian offensive in Kharkiv in May last year, we were in a trench with a group of special forces called the Peaky Blinders, who were attacking Russians who were advancing on their positions. They were engaged in a firefight with the Ukrainian infantry about a mile and a half away from us. And Russian drones were obviously in the air looking for targets, and they hovered over our tree line where we were hidden. And so that was quite an intense, 20 minutes, and it was part of a big battle. We were there for 6 hours in quite an exposed position. And sadly, actually, I learned that the commander of that unit was killed in action just yesterday.
So, Maxim, we're very grateful that you have the time and you can speak to us today from Ukraine itself. And I'm going to ask you in detail about your recent dispatch on the drone battalions wiping out oil refineries and airfields inside Russia. But before that, can you just give us an overview about where you've been on this particular reporting trip to Ukraine so far?
So I've been in Kiev talking to people about the possible peace deal and what might happen there. And I've also been in Sumy with 3 paratrooper brigades who are fighting the Russians inside Kursk, and finding out what their experiences are like fighting the North Koreans there, and what's changed on the battlefield over the past six months since the invasion started. And now we're in Kharkiv. We've been talking to people who say that they've organized the first ever all robotic assault on a Russian position. It seems to have gone quite successfully. And we're investigating that and seeing exactly how it works, and what that means for the future of the war here.
And I mean, that sounds absolutely fascinating. Can you tell me a bit more about it?
So yeah, it's a group called the Hartier Brigade. They have deployed kind of remote control robots which have machine guns attached to the top of them. It's the first time that they've been used in a kind of platoon-sized force against a Russian position. And what happened was those robots advanced on the Russian position some, over several kilometers. They have a low profile. They're quite difficult to spot, especially in kind of snowy, muddy fields. And several of those robots engaged the Russians and basically suppressed their enemy fire with very accurate rifle fire, which is aided by AI. And then another robot went and dropped off two anti-tank mines that then detonated inside the Russian position, blowing it up completely.
And how many robots did you see?
Well, they've been quite secretive about how many robots are involved in it. You can see in the video there's definitely three. We went to visit the brigade, and we saw about 5 or 6 robots, them using them in the field, showing us how they work and how they practice. But they're quite secretive about exactly how many robots they're able to deploy in this way.
Understandably so. Are you having any idea so far as into how much impact they're actually having using this new kind of warfare?
Well, it seems to be very much in the testing stage. They're seeing what works and what doesn't work, and they're advancing technology to go along with it. I mean, one of the drawbacks of these robots originally was that they couldn't go very far because they're ground based, and it's difficult to provide a wireless signal to them along the floor. Now they've seemed to have fixed that by relaying signal via drones that are in the air, so they can travel much further, several kilometers now. The targeting seems to be better with AI. They fixed some of the problems with moving over kind of frozen or rutted ground. But there are several different companies developing quite quickly these different robotics, and there has yet to be a kind of consolidated purchase by the Ukrainian government that would allow them to scale up this endeavor. And I think that's what we need to see, that the Ukrainian government to decide which ones are effective, what are the most effective drones to use in this way, and how could they do that. And, we spoke also to factory producing drones different from the ones that were used in this attack. Quite sophisticated. They work usually with special forces, but they want to scale up their efforts. And they say that where other companies are focused on producing kind of quite expensive drones, they're focused on just producing a lot of cheap drones, and hoping that they can be as effective as Mavics have been in this war, the kind of the airborne drones. And so they can effectively replace a rifleman, just have a small robot with a Kalashnikov moving onto the battlefield and being very high maneuverable.
Have you already published this, or when can we see it? We'll read about it.
Next week, it will be out next week.
Okay, look forward to seeing that one. Thanks for talking to us about it in advance. Now, you have written a fascinating dispatch about the Ukrainian drone battalion's long-range strikes into Russia. You wouldn't want to disclose exactly where that location is, I'm sure, but can you tell us a bit about the kind of launch sites they're using?
I can't tell you very much about the kind of launch sites they use. I mean, these are big drones. They travel, up to 1,000 kilometers, so they need a significant space to be launched from, and they launch them in squadrons, several at a time from different places, trying to overwhelm Russian defenses. And they use these in conjunction with other weapons like British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles or ATACMS, and lots of smaller decoy drones, which are designed to exhaust the Russians' anti-aircraft missiles. And then after the decoys have gone through, then the main drones, after the decoys have exhausted the Russian anti-aircraft batteries, then the main drones kind of fly through these gaps. They try and avoid also the best defended spaces along the Russian border, and then they penetrate very deep inside Russia. And we've seen them enjoyed great success hitting Russian oil refineries and gas production facilities. We've seen about 20 from 30 of these really major facilities going up in smoke, huge blazes at those facilities, probably inflicting hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of damage on Russia's economy, and also depriving Russia of vital fuel for its tanks and jets.
We've seen an uptick in number of these attacks throughout the month of January, haven't we? Do you get the sense that this is something we're going to see more of, that they have the backup and the supplies to do so?
Yeah, Ukraine has realized this is a really effective strategy. They also told me about military targets they've been hitting, such as air bases. and the damage that they were doing on Russian jets and the infrastructure, importantly, that supplies Russian jets. The kind of the fuel storages, the ammunition supply places, and that's having a really strong impact on Russia's ability to wage an aerial war on Ukraine. We've seen actually that there are a lot less glide bombs falling on frontline positions than there were previously. Soldiers have talked along the front have talked to me about this. We used to get hit all the time with Russian glide bombs, and now it's fewer and fewer. And that's because the Russians are having to fly from air bases that are further away because they've been pushed back by these attacks by the long-range Ukrainian drones.
And these battalions that you met, who are they exactly, and how well trained are they?
So we met the 14th UAV Regiment. It's a mix of former Special Forces soldiers who are very, very highly trained. The commander of that regiment completed the US-designed Special Forces qualification course, which is a really grueling course known as the Q course. And he'd also completed 121 high-altitude, low-opening parachute jumps, which are very, very difficult, very grueling, and showed some of his character. A lot of the people that he's working with are also former Special Forces guys. They also have engineers, and they have some support in terms of intelligence from Western countries as well.
And the commander of the 14th UAV Regiment told you about their first successful operation to the east of Rostov in Russia. What did he tell you? And did you get a real sense of accomplishment when he was talking to you, in that he was able to take the fight on the offensive into Russia?
Yeah, I think that was a pivotal moment for them because they realized this technology worked, that Russia had such a large area to defend that it would struggle to do it. And also the Russians were obviously taken by surprise and completely unprepared for such a deep, long-range strike deep inside their territory, and they weren't ready for it. And in that attack, he said that they had basically been able to wipe out all the aircraft on an airbase near the border. The Russians had left out in the open fighter jets, bombers, fuel and ammunition, which helped them destroy it. Now, we weren't able to verify those claims, but obviously the way that they've scaled up the attacks and the way that they've used them so effectively on things that we can tell from open source, seeing oil refineries on fire in that way, we can see that they're obviously getting through the Russian defenses and they're obviously effective.
And have you seen, or did they tell you about any ways that they've noticed the Russians have responded to this mounting threat they're posing? How have they adapted their defences, and what kinds of threats are the Ukrainian battalions themselves facing?
Well, they're obviously the launch sites and the battalions themselves are obviously a high priority target for the Russians. And they talked about having received radio intercepts about how the Russians were searching for them, looking for them in order to counter them with a ballistic missile strike or something very fast, a fast reaction to hit them at the launch site, or to try and individually target, find out, identify who the members of this regiment are, and then individually target them. So they're obviously on a kind of hit list for the Russians. But they take, very serious precautions to avoid that happening. They're very secretive. They don't often speak to the media. We were very privileged to be given access to join them on a launch mission and to find out so much information about what it is that they do. And they also, one of the reasons they're drawn from special forces is that they're highly organized, they're very intelligent, and they get stuff done very quickly and efficiently. So they get to the launch site, they launch these drones, and then, within about 20 minutes, they're off again, and it's difficult for the Russians to target them.
And last time we spoke, Maxim, you were talking about the threat that Russia was posing with its drones that are immune to electronic warfare because they use fiber optic cables instead of radio signals. New video seems to have emerged purporting to show that Ukraine can detect these drones now with a mobile radar station. Have you seen or heard much about this?
But that's another thing that's being kept quite secretive, but it's very interesting. I mean, the war is causing technological advances that are happening so rapidly, it's sometimes difficult to keep up. Now, I suspect that the radar is able to detect the very large spooling device, which spools out the fiber optic cable. I mean, you have to have 10 kilometers of even this very thin fiber optic thread, and that creates quite a big lump on top of a drone. And I suspect that is what they're able to detect because it gives the aircraft a slightly bigger profile. But there's still a big problem of how you then engage that drone. We've seen some kind of rudimentary efforts shooting down things with what look like shotguns appeared on drones. Maybe there's a way that the Ukrainians can find to cut these wires in the air. But they're still having a really big impact on the front line, particularly in Kursk, where Ukrainian soldiers are very worried about them. They say they've all practiced their shooting because they want to be able to shoot these down with a shotgun or even their Kalashnikovs. And that's what they're actually doing. That's the most effective way at the moment to counter these drones. I mean, I heard a story, I don't know if it's an apocryphal story or not, but the story of one soldier who saw a fiber optic drone going past him, and the cable was unspooling, and apparently he grabbed it and bit through it to stop it hitting a position. We'll see if that's true, because there were some rumors that he was going to be awarded a medal.
Interesting, and it's so interesting when you see the juxtaposition of such huge, amazing technological advances and innovations compared to the very rudimentary way that you are then forced to deal with what you can actually now achieve by the advances, if you see what I mean, in terms of the shotguns that you're talking about. What did you learn about the fighting in Kursk?
So it's very interesting. I mean, we were mostly talking about the impact of the North Koreans who came in mid-December and seem to have departed, or at least are not launching massive assaults for the last couple of weeks. So there was a month of very, very intensive fighting where the North Koreans would attack up to 9 times a day these Ukrainian positions, and they're extremely highly motivated. They're very fast, they're very well trained, and they're young, and the right age to be soldiers. They're fit and athletic. And that posed a lot of problems for the Ukrainians, because obviously at this stage in the war, 3 years on, a lot of Ukrainian soldiers are mobilized. A lot of them are older, and they're not so motivated. They've taken a lot of casualties. They've seen a lot of people die, and that tends to have a very negative impact on morale. As a result of that, Ukraine had lost some positions to the North Koreans, but they had inflicted an unbelievably heavy price on the North Korean infantry, and that maybe is one of the reasons we now see them withdrawn. One regimental commander told me that they basically wiped out 2 entire brigades of North Korean troops, about 5,000 troops. And now that the North Koreans gone, they had a chance of pushing back and recapturing some of those positions. I think what we saw is that the North Koreans were not very well supported by Russian troops. They were sent in as infantry without armor, without tanks, and often without much artillery support, and even without much drone support, and they don't use drones themselves. So they were very vulnerable crossing the fields to the Ukrainians. They will now have to regroup and take probably what they've learned about this new method of warfare with drones in the air and having to use smaller groups and not advancing in large waves back either to Pyongyang or to their command center in Russia, and rethink entirely how they fight. If they can find a way to fight better and communicate better with Russian forces, or if Russia is prepared to support them better on their attacks, then they will be quite a formidable fighting force.
And when you talk to me about the discrepancy in age between the Ukrainian troops and the North Korean troops, did you get any sense or chance to talk to the Ukrainian troops about whether they would actually welcome the lowering of the age of conscription?
Yeah, I did, and I talked to some very thoughtful soldiers about this who said, "Look, this war is hell. We don't want young people to be exposed to it before they live their life, and it's not just a matter of people dying when they're very young, but it's also a matter of psychologically being exposed to these traumatic scenes before you're ready for it." And so, what they would prefer to see is for soldiers to be given, for young people to be trained, to be prepared, to be psychologically made ready, and when they reach a certain point, because they think this war is probably going to continue for years and years, then they will be ready to be soldiers, and they'll be more effective soldiers. I think what they were really upset about is the idea that young people would be taken off the streets, mobilized, given a month or two of training, and then thrown into the fight, and their lives would be wasted, because they've seen that happen time after time again, and they want to avoid that for the younger soldiers.
Interesting that you say that they think the war is going to carry on for years and years and years. And when you were in Kyiv and you were talking about the prospects of any kind of peace talks or ceasefire or whatever you want to call it, what was the message you were getting? What is the thinking?
Yeah, I think there was a bit of a disconnect between Kiev and the front line. I think the soldiers they don't believe that the Russians will stop, and they don't think that it's realistic that Putin will stop or agree to anything, particularly when he's making gains. And this kind of long, drawn-out negotiations potentially very bad for the Ukrainians because everyone's expecting peace, and in the meantime, they don't get the weapons that they need. Um, and that's problematic, and that's worrying for them. In Kiev, they're obviously readying themselves for the visit by Keith Kellogg, who's going to be Trump's representative on these kind of peace negotiations, and seeing how they can accommodate what the US wants. But there's still such a big question mark over whether Putin would be even vaguely interested in accepting any reasonable terms for Ukraine that don't compromise the entire country's sovereignty. And there are other, behind closed doors, there are some Ukrainians who are political consultants, people connected to senior political figures who said, look, I think it's going to end up being a game where we say, yes, of course, we're willing to go to the talks, and the Russians will say, yes, of course, we're willing to go to the talks, but neither side really believes it's going to happen, and it's all driven by the US.
I just want to get your thoughts on a development that's been announced this week by France, the first of their French Mirage planes in Ukraine and ready. How important do you think this addition is to Ukraine's fleet of combat aircraft? Because there has been talk that they will be used in the area where you are right now in Kharkiv.
Yeah, it's very interesting that the French have accepted Mirages because, more than a year ago, I spoke to the commander of Ukraine's Air Force, and he was saying it's not useful to have lots of different platforms in the air because we have to provide different supplies and different weapons to each platform. So we just want to have F-16s. We don't want to have lots of different things. Thank you very much for the French offer, but actually it's not going to be useful for us because we need technicians, we need engineers, people who understand their aircraft. And now they seem to have changed that, perhaps because the situation is now so desperate that they're willing to accept, a handful, not a large amount of French jets, and with all the infrastructure that will come with that, which is different to the F-16 infrastructure. And really, if they're going to have a meaningful air force in the long term, they're going to need another platform as well, because the French don't have that many Mirages. Even if the French were to retire their entire fleet, it's still less than 100. And so a lot of those will have to be cannibalized for parts for aircraft that are in service all the time. So it was very interesting to me that the Ukrainians had gone along with that. Maybe just because they've been so frustrated by the slow pace of the US training and supply of F-16s.
And do you know what they'll be able to do exactly? I mean, there is talk that they might be able to actually get Scalp missiles into Russia or Storm
Yeah,
Shadow
those
missiles.
planes are capable of delivering Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles. They're also capable of intercepting enemy rockets, enemy planes. So they have a kind of a dual role there. And obviously, it's better than nothing, but it does require this whole kind of ecosystem to go around it. It's going to be very expensive for Ukraine at a time when it's not sure of Western support, and particularly with Trump curtailing aid across Ukraine. The impacts of cancelling US aid funding to Ukraine has been absolutely massive. I know at least a dozen people who were out of a job overnight. They're working on humanitarian matters. They're working on supplying displaced people with homes and electricity and generators. All of that stuff has ground to a halt as a result of Trump's decision. And the Ukrainian government is saying, we're now going to have to step forward and fund all that ourselves. We're going to try and fund all that ourselves when they're already the economy is already in a dire situation.
That's a 90-day stoppage for the moment, isn't it? I mean, presumably the people you've spoken to just can't believe that it's happened. I mean, what other stories have you heard about the impact it's had?
Yeah, I mean, 3 months in this war is an incredibly long time, and it gives a huge advantage to another side. And the scale that Ukraine requires humanitarian assistance, with the level of damage to its infrastructure that is continuing daily, it is shocking that is happening. And if I know a dozen people who've been laid off overnight, then over 90 days, that's going to become a growing pool of people who are unable to deliver the vital supplies that Ukrainians displaced population, which is growing constantly, needs, especially as the Russians continue to advance, especially in the Donbass region, where the Russians are now kind of at the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which is home to one of Ukraine's largest cities, the Dnipro. And if they continue to push forward there are inevitably going to be many more displaced people, a lot more damage to infrastructure, a lot more damage to homes.
You've been now obviously many times to Ukraine. I'm just wondering how you assess the situation now on this particular trip, if you're able to give us an overview, if that's possible.
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians. I mean, economically, they're suffering. They need U.S. support. It's now in doubt. So there's a lot of kind of big reasons why it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to hold the ground that it needs to hold, and it might need to kind of change the way that it fights entirely. You know, they've been trying to hold every single centimeter of territory, and that's cost a lot of lives. And a lot of the soldiers that I spoke to said it's not the way we should be fighting. We need to preserve our manpower, particularly the people who are motivated and trained. We can't be throwing them away on constant assaults to try and regain tactically insignificant territory. And we need to be prepared that actually we're going to surrender some more territory in the fighting in order to get into maneuver warfare, which we're much better at. So there are thoughts about how it's going to happen, but I'm always inspired by how many thoughtful people I encounter in Ukraine, how many innovative people I encounter in Ukraine, how many solutions they're coming up with. Whereas Russia is basically taking ideas from Iran and kind of other and China and kind of remaking them domestically. Ukrainians are really coming up with very innovative solutions to problems. They're working with their networks to solve things and make sure that as much as possible can be done with robots or drones. And I really expect over the next year we're going to see a huge ramp up in that and land drone capability and the use of AI. AI is already being used by some drones. If jamming interferes with the radio signal of an attack drone, an FPV drone, within the last kilometer, it can decide on its own target. Now, that's already happening on some sectors of the battlefield. And AI is probably going to be an even more important factor going forward. So, and I also met several commanders who are still very highly motivated. I met some troops that are very highly motivated, and I was impressed by them. So, there are difficult situations, but I do think the Ukrainians are determined to prevail, and they will find ways to make it difficult for the Russians. The big question mark is whether the rest of the world is prepared to support Ukraine in the way that it requires to send a message to Russia that this stops here and it doesn't go on to the Baltics or it doesn't go on to another Black Sea neighbor.
Keep up the good work. Maxim Tucker, great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.